Hey all, EC here, and today I want to talk about classic Pokemon and why we haven't seen the games on Nintendo Switch or the Switch 2 eShop yet, and whether or not I think the actual rumours around the classic collection of like classic, Gen 1, Gen 2 Pokemon games coming to Switch Itch and Switch 2 for, the 2025, 2026, why I don't think it's going to happen. Let me explain why in this video. Now, before we get into all that, make sure you subscribe and like all that sort of stuff. Guys, trying to get 2,000 subscribers, need all that, help and whatever. But let's get into it. So, the first thing I don't think that's gonna be a big thorn side here is obviously the fact that you would have to get these games to work with Pokemon Home. Now, if it didn't work with Pokemon Home and you couldn't transfer these Pokemon from obviously these earlier titles like Pokemon Yellow, Pokemon Silver and whatever, to later games in the series, that might be a bigger turn-off for a lot of people. And also, they did have this ability with Pokemon games when they were released on the Nintendo 3DS eShop back in the day. Obviously, back then it was known as Pokemon Bank. But whether or not they'd actually have those features work for a Switch 2 or Switch 1 version of these games, you'd have to do some reworking. And whether or not the Pokemon company actually wants to do that, is a factor we have to factor in to start with. We also need to factor in the price. How would they charge for these games? How much would they charge for these games? So they did charge like $10 for these games back in the day, but due to how popular Pokemon is and the demand for these games, especially if you look on the second-hand market for the cartridges and stuff, I think the Pokemon company would try and utilize that as a way to try and upcharge for these games. They release them digitally, but also it makes it feel like they're seeing this and they're trying to use it as a way to justify remaking these games. Because when you remake the games, obviously, you can charge whatever you want for these games. And as we've seen with Pokemon Yellow, for example, they remade Pokemon Yellow, which itself was the definitive version of Pokemon Red and Blue. Blue itself being a tweaked version of Pokemon Green. When they remade Pokemon Yellow as Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu, obviously they charged $60 per game. And obviously, that's what if you want to buy both Pokemon, Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu, that's $120, right? And I think the Pokemon company doesn't want to lose out on a lot of that revenue they could potentially make from, remaking these games, because obviously, let's be fair, Pokemon is such a big franchise. There are so many fans. There's such a large audience for Pokemon. Not only because of obviously the cute characters in the game, like Pikachu, for example, but also the appeal towards not even a younger audience, but also an established audience who has been playing the games for the last 30 plus years. Now, do I think we're not going to get any classic Pokemon games at all? No, I don't. I do think, the Pokemon company would be stupid not to re-release some of these games, especially due to how much criticism they have been facing for the current state of Pokemon on Switch 1 and Switch 2. If you don't know, there's a lot of criticism around these games now for being too easy and just not being as enjoyable and just being very simple. There's many Pokemon games are argued to be some of the worst games in the series, and they were also all released on the Switch 1, which, include games like Pokemon Brilliant Diamond, Shine and Pearl, which, people didn't like. Pokemon Friends is another example of a Pokemon game, which personally I don't really like, but also a lot of people don't like because of what it is. But also, the people who want to have that nostalgia hit and play these classic games, I feel like releasing these games on like Switch 1 or Switch 2 and via the eShop, that could potentially see a huge boost in revenue for the Pokemon companies. Let's be fair. People who love Pokemon love the older games, whereas the new games, well, they prefer the older games in most regards. But also the fact that these games are so hard to get hold of, and obviously, a lot of people will have to, pay out their kids, their children's entire college fund and whatever to buy these games. It just makes sense to re-release them on modern hardware. It just obviously comes down to the greed of whether the Pokemon company wants to remake these games instead, charge a higher fee, and let's be real, make these games worse in a lot of ways, graphically or, mechanically, because, these new Pokemon games are just easy and a lot of them are just boring as well. So re-releasing the classic games would go over really well with fans. It just comes down to whether or not the Pokemon company, and it's obviously its owners like Nintendo, like Game Freak, like Creatures Inc., want to actually do it, and whether or not they see value in doing that. And I think if they didn't see value in re-releasing these old games, they are genuinely, insane, because people want to play these games. You look at how much some of these games go on the second-hand market, and it makes so much sense that, the Pokemon company should just re-release these games, because, why do they care if a Pokemon cartridge costs $150 or whatever, complete in box, for example? Like, for them, you know, if they could just sell the game on the eShop, whatever, they would make more money than, you know, if they just let people just get it on the second-hand market, because obviously, you know, the Pokemon Company has no reason to let the second-hand prices be so expensive, because they're not going to see any money from it, so they might as well just keep re-releasing the games anyway, so people can actually enjoy these classic games. But, you know, it all comes down to what they want to do, whether or not they think their newer games, you know, should take precedent over their older stuff, which I think they are doing. I think they believe the newer Pokemon games are obviously the ones that people want to play. And I understand, because obviously you can charge more for these games and whatever, and I do kind of understand the mentality, but it just kind of comes a little bit annoying, because these classic games just should be made available in modern hardware so we can all play them. If not, just, you know, Switch and Switch 2, maybe let them play it on mobile phones or something. Let's put, I don't know, like a small fee to play them on mobile phones. Like, having copies of these games on modern hard system is genuinely a dream for a lot of people. And I feel like the Pokemon Company should do more to actually make these games available, because obviously they put a few games on Switch Online, and I don't think these games will come to Switch Online, but there's just a lot of stuff that they need to do to make these games really work on modern hardware as well. But they can do it. They made it work for the 3DS, so why can't they make it work on the Switch and Switch 2? Anyway, guys, let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. Let me know what you think. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, share, comment, all that sort of stuff. I've been EC, and I'm signing out. Peace.